As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So this story says that Hamas says it wants to extend truce with Israel after the latest prisoner swap. So since Friday, since this ceasefire or pause, whatever you want to call it, came into effect, it has pretty much held. There's been Israeli fire on Palestinians who were trying to return to northern Gaza, displaced Palestinians who were trying to go back home. They were fired on, but besides that, I haven't seen any major violations of the ceasefire aspect of the deal, and they've been exchanging prisoners throughout the 3 days. So Hamas said on Sunday that it's ready to extend the 4-day truce with Israel after the two sides exchanged prisoners for the third straight day. Hamas said in a statement, quote, "The Islamic resistance movement Hamas seeks to extend the truce after the 4-day period ends through serious efforts to increase the number of those released from imprisonment as stipulated in the humanitarian ceasefire agreement," end quote. So the hostage deal allows an extension in the 4-day truce in exchange for Hamas releasing more hostages. Earlier in the day, a Hamas source told AFP that the group could potentially release 20 to 40 more Israelis. Qatar, which brokered the deal, said that Hamas does need to locate dozens of Israeli women and children who are being held in Gaza by other groups, not by Hamas. And Qatar is saying they need to do that in order to extend the pause in fighting. So the Israeli side has expressed interest in extending the 4-day truce if Hamas releases more prisoners, while making it clear that the war will continue once the pause is over. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with President Biden on Sunday and said his government is willing to extend the ceasefire 1 day for every 10 hostages that Hamas releases. So Netanyahu said that he also told Biden that, quote, "At the end of the deal, we are returning to full power to carry out our aims. Destroy Hamas, ensure that Gaza won't return to what it was, and of course to free all of our hostages," end quote. This article is from Nick Turse at The Intercept, and it's really something. It says that U.S. military outposts in Iraq and Syria are plagued by thefts of weapons and equipment, according to exclusive documents obtained by The Intercept that show militias and criminal gangs are systematically targeting U.S. forces. Military investigations launched earlier this year found that multiple sensitive weapons and equipment, including guided missile launch systems as well as drones, have been stolen from Iraq, and this follows hundreds of thousands of dollars in military gear that were purloined from U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria between 2020 and 2022. So that is a lot of theft. Weapons are being stolen straight out of the bases. Missiles, it's unbelievable. And it goes to show, as Terse, the point he makes in this piece, as these bases are coming under attack and the U.S. is claiming that they're protecting the troops there, if they can't protect the bases from theft of this scale, there's no way that they can really say that they're protecting the U.S. troops who are at these bases in Iraq and Syria, who are just basically sitting ducks to pay for Biden's support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. This article is from Kyle Anzalone, and it says that David Arakhamia, who's a high-ranking member of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, has confirmed that Kiev could have ended the war with Russia after a month if it agreed not to join NATO. So Arakhamia was leading the Ukrainian delegation in peace talks with Russia in March 2022 when they met in Istanbul, and negotiations continued into April virtually. And at the time, it was very clear that Russia's main demand was Ukrainian neutrality. Say you're not going to join NATO. There was also other things about denazification, demilitarization that was very vague. But he says in this interview with a Ukrainian TV channel, he says that other stuff wasn't really important. It was all about the neutrality. He said, quote, "They really hoped almost to the last moment that they would force us to sign such an agreement so that we would take neutrality. It was the most important thing for them. They were prepared for an end to the war if we agreed to neutrality and committed that we would not join NATO," end quote. He said everything else was simply rhetoric and political seasoning, talking about the denazification and that stuff. He also explained that Kiev was unlikely to accept Putin's offer during the talks in Istanbul because Ukrainian leadership did not believe Russia could be trusted. However, he went on to say that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson cemented Kiev on the path of fighting a long war with Russia. So essentially what he says is, we probably couldn't trust Russia, although there was supposed to be some sort of security guarantees. But the crux here is that he is confirming that Boris Johnson went over to Kiev in April 2022, which was reported by Ukrainian media, and said that they don't want to sign a deal. He said, quote, "Moreover, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight," end quote. So China called the U.S. the biggest disruptor of peace in the South China Sea after a U.S. warship sailed near Chinese-controlled islands in the disputed waters. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said Saturday that the guided missile destroyer USS Hopper sailed near the Paracel Islands, known as the Shisha Islands in China, in an operation known as the Freedom of Navigation Operations, what they call FONAPs. And the U.S. began regularly conducting FONAPs to challenge China's claims to the South China Sea in 2015. The area where the USS Hopper conducted the FONAP is also claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam. The Chinese military said that it warned off the U.S. warship after it entered the Paracel Islands' territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles from the coastline. So that's pretty close. When they do these FONAPs, the U.S. Navy gets pretty close to these islands claimed by China that are controlled by China, that are much closer to China than the Chinese mainland than the United States.
Trump had little respect for the First Amendment, Democrats claimed. He attacked freedom of speech and of the press, striking at our fundamental rights. On top of this, liberal media outlets alleged Trump used his office for personal gain and weaponized the justice system for his own benefit. After January the 6th, 2021, the liberals who had been skeptical about anti-Trump hysteria became convinced that the hysterics had been right all along. But Friday's release of the first tranche of January 6th tapes confirmed that Trump's actions paled in comparison to the steps Democrats have taken to defeat him and his supporters. The tapes corroborate public's previous reporting and show that the Democrat-driven narrative of an insurrection was highly misleading. Democrats used this narrative to demonize tens of millions of voters, to justify their censorship efforts, and to weaponize the justice system against their political enemies. They've continually spoken about MAGA extremism. Hillary Clinton's even said about debugging and decoding Trump extremists. And to refer to those events of January the 6th as an attempt at insurrection is hysterical, and it seems to me that, like many crises in recent years, was exploited to legitimize legislation to advance further control and condemnation of an opponent and the movement affiliated with that opponent. That seems more reasonable than that was an attempt to take over the country and run it differently in baseball caps, sort of while smiling, sort of grinning nervously. It's true that the tapes show rioters forcefully entering the Capitol, and some scenes on the tape are not peaceful. It's also true that Trump's rhetoric has at times been inflammatory and illiberal. But inflammatory rhetoric has been present on both sides. If you're continually talking about Hitler, that's about the most incendiary thing you can say about anyone, isn't it? But what the tapes do not show is a coup attempt. Rather, they show many scenes that contradict this narrative, like January 6ers walking calmly down the hallway, Capitol Police appearing completely unfazed by these supposed insurrectionists, and Capitol Police giving the trespassers handshakes. Yeah, because they're broadly speaking pro-police, aren't they? That's the kind of, one might assume, their general stance. So it seems like there's not been an objective appraisal of those events. There's been a highly biased exploitation of those events, which is in keeping with what we understand about 9/11. Like, you know, in this moment, there's not question the origins and how 9/11 was carried out, but what was 9/11 used to facilitate? In this conversation, let's not question the origins of the pandemic, but let's look at how the pandemic was used. Was it used to legitimize regulation, to bring about policies that otherwise would have been impossible, to generate profits? Did it make things economically worse for the vast majority of people while improving the economic conditions of the elite? There's so many clear examples now of how crises of various kinds are exploited to legitimize the agenda of the powerful that it seems sort of almost redundant to keep pointing it out. Despite the evidence that law enforcement at best permitted this coup to take place and at worst facilitated it, January 6 judges have handed down extremely harsh sentences. They sentenced one defendant to 22 years in prison, despite the fact that he wasn't even in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. You'd think that would be a pretty good alibi. Were you in Washington, D.C. on January 6th? I was not. 22 years! Oh no, Jesus Christ! What's more, the January 6th tapes show scenes that are far less violent than Black Lives Matter riots, which were investigated and prosecuted with much greater lenience, even in cases of arson and assault. We've been able to show many times on our channel how both January 6 protesters and Black Lives Matter protesters were subject to the exploitation of the same surveillance laws, which should be illegal were it not for manipulation of particular clauses that Section 702 permits. But there's no question that these protest movements have been used differently. In our country, about 11 or 12 years ago, there were a bunch of riots, and they prosecuted the people that participated in that riot super fast. They expedited all of the cases because anything that seems like a threat to the system is often met with a response that shows the ability of authority to crush dissent. Above all, the newly released tapes demonstrate that the Democratic Party's claims to be fighting for democracy and staving off authoritarianism are a sham, and that it's the Democrats who have, in their persecution of Trump and his followers, done more to undermine democracy than Trump ever threatened to do. Elites in the Democratic Party and in the mainstream media, through their efforts to subdue a populist backlash, have eroded First Amendment rights and have politicized the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. Democrats became everything they once said they feared in Trump: censorial, totalitarian, and corrupt. Their years-long clampdown on dissent and criminalization of political opposition was a systematic attack on liberal democracy. Worse, they became everything that liberals during the 20th century warned Americans about. The Twitter files, the Missouri v. Biden case, and the Facebook files have exposed the lengths to which Democrats went to quash opposition and prevent citizens from exercising the right to protected speech. At the same time as the federal government has pushed for censorship, the FBI under Biden has increasingly become a domestic spying agency, turning its efforts against regular Americans. When whistleblowers step forward to push back against the Bureau's partisan or unethical practices, the FBI retaliates against them. Meanwhile, the Biden's DOJ is inappropriately shielding him and his son from any accountability for their lucrative influence peddling operation. A growing body of evidence suggests that President Biden played a major role in his son's business and that the DOJ is protecting the president from repercussions. This is precisely the type of corruption Democrats warned Trump would bring to the office of the presidency. The Democratic Party and the Biden administration have become precisely what liberals said Trump would be, and they have attacked the foundational principles of our democracy in the name of protecting them. How did this happen?
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
It was extremely demoralizing. Now, let's leave Newsom out of the conversation till later, but it was extremely demoralizing to see somebody like Gretchen Whitmer get rewarded. That people who were, in effect, tortured by some of these governors completely unscientifically. If after all this, Florida has better all-cause mortality numbers than California, that's all the statistic you need to know. And then to observe them getting back in office. Now, you are not just a commentator, but a political candidate. You've been a political candidate a couple times. And as a political candidate, it's your job to be hopeful and optimistic. Explain to me how I should be hopeful and optimistic when Gretchen Whitmer gets reelected.
Well, I'm not sure it's my job as a politician to be hopeful and optimistic. I think it's my job to tell the truth and to have policies that make people better off. By the way, I was just at a party yesterday, Tom, and I met a doctor whom I didn't know. He was a pathologist. And I asked him his opinion about how we handled the COVID crisis. And he said, "Do you really want to go there?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." I didn't realize he knew who I was and knew that I did not agree with him. And he said, "I feel very strongly about this. The COVID vaccine saved lives. I'm very angry about people who say otherwise." And I said, "Well, not too surprisingly, I feel differently." He said, "Well, you're not a pathologist." I said, "No, and you're not an economist." And I said, "There are trade-offs." And he said, "Well, I don't want to have this conversation anymore." It's when I ran for governor, I was called anti-vax. Now, Tom, I'd been vaccinated because my doctor told me that I should get vaccinated because of my age, because I've got so-called comorbidities. I have high blood pressure. I have a very rare blood disease. And for those reasons, he recommended that I get vaccinated. I followed his advice. In retrospect, I don't believe I would have followed his advice. But my point is, it should not have been mandated. There should not have been vaccine mandates, as there have been in California under Gavin Newsom, mass mandates, as there have been in California under Gavin Newsom. They certainly shouldn't have closed businesses, and they certainly shouldn't have closed schools. Our schools are right near the bottom of all 50 states in America. 75% of black third graders can neither read nor do math at grade level. They lost 2 full years of in-school education, which will translate into earnings loss over the course of their lives. It was the most outrageous response to a pandemic, I think, in the history of the world. And when Gavin Newsom shut down the state, there was a specific date when you weren't supposed to go to work. Because I'm in media at the time, I was exempt. So I got in my car at the same time to go to work. And I thought, Tom, maybe there would be 50% less traffic. Because I thought so many people would say, "Screw you, I'm going to work. You're not going to tell me what to do," that they would not have enough jails to fill the people who violated the mandate. And after a few days, they would repeal it. I was shocked. I got in my car, and you could have rolled a bowling ball down one of the busiest streets in LA and not hit anybody. I was shocked that so many people simply complied. I was blown away by that. I didn't realize that people were going to be that compliant, act like lemmings, and follow the advice given by somebody who, by the way, kept his own business in operation, Gavin Newsom, had his own kids in school education, while laughing and yucking it up at that restaurant in Napa Valley called the French Laundry with the very same people, Tom, who drafted the mandates. He was not wearing a mask. He was not engaging in social distancing. And they incurred a $12,000 wine tab at taxpayers' expense. I don't know that much about wine, but I assure you he was not drinking Mad Dog 2020. So for all those reasons, I thought that the average person in California would say, The hell with you. You're not going to tell me what to do. You're not going to tell me I can't have a livelihood. A third of all restaurants in the state of California are now gone forever. And these are primarily the mom and poppers owned by black and brown people, the people that the left purports to care about.
Turn the clock back a bit to earlier in your life. Can you share with my audience what your background is and how it is that you came to hold what we would, I think, legitimately call dissident views?
So it's my long way of saying this, Tom. I was always raised not to be a victim. My mother told me nobody can make you feel inferior without your permission. So I always felt confident. I always felt that if I worked hard, invested in myself, I could make something out of myself. So I was never somebody who said, woe is me, the man is holding me back. I can't say that made me a conservative or libertarian, which I ultimately became, but I was always one of those in my class when the other kids would whine about this or the other. I would give another point of view, a dissident point of view. And I wasn't called a sellout or an Uncle Tom in those days, but I was called somebody, they would roll their eyes, oh, that's Larry, oh, that's Larry. When I would offer a different point of view as to whether or not we were oppressed for this reason or that reason. I went to an all-black high school. A handful of people were not black, but most of the kids were black. And there was a poem we studied in class by a black poet named County Cullen. And it goes like this. While riding through old Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue, called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. The teacher was angry. She was black. The class was angry. I got angry. So I'm walking home, and I knew my mom was going to have a different perspective on the poem. I didn't know what it was going to be. I walked in the house. She was frying some chicken wings, my favorite, and stirring a big pot of greens. I said, Mom, we read a poem in class. I want to get your reaction to it. She said, sure, what is it? I said, it goes like this. While riding through a Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean, people looking straight at me. I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. My mom took the spoon out of the pot, hit it on the side, and said, Larry, what a darn shame he allowed something like that to spoil his vacation. How many wings do you want? So that's always been my attitude, Tom. And then I studied economics, I studied Milton Friedman, I studied Ayn Rand, and I realized that I was, in fact, a hardcore libertarian. And I've been that way ever since.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
This was another January 6th video that's come out, in which there's an individual. By the way, that one that I showed of someone looking like they were flashing a badge, I got that 100% wrong. I saw a cleaner image down the line, and he was just showing off his vape pen. Here's another video, though, from the January 6th footage that's been making its rounds. And supposedly in this video, you've got a person, well, there was even a New York Times article. I'm misspeaking here. There's been claims, which was the joke I had made at the beginning of January 6th, that if I was a lawyer or one of these people, I would just say that I'd been pushed. In this video, you got a person who I guess was, curious, just wanted to scope out the door. And then there's a person who's literally pulling people over the line. And here you have, I think, audio of a nice old lady being like, why did you pull me in here? There you go. So we've got some individuals who, even on the day of, are claiming, why did you just push me into this building? And what I think would be the most interesting is really the video footage of who were the people that opened up the doors, opened up the windows. Now you've already got the claims that the crowd was peaceful until they started throwing the stun grenades and whatever else into it. They got it all rallied up and going. But here you have footage of door team open 6 of front lines, people in big time military gear as the first people in, who must have some experience in, I guess, opening up government doors and windows. You would think maybe they would unenforce them, in the days beforehand. But like I said, the most interesting things of the January 6th, I haven't seen these breakdowns yet, are start to finish, the people who are now sitting in jail, what they were doing, how they got into the building, what they did while they were in the building. And I think if you could show the sped up version of people peacefully entering the building and along with their prison sentences, I do think that will be quite persuasive to general people. And then if you can really hone in on who are the people like this, who is that guy who broke in, got the doors open, and do they have relationships with law enforcement? I think we're going to be doing something in terms of getting some of those political prisoners out of jail. I do always like when they have the articles trying to debunk the claims. And in doing so, they're actually just admitting to the claims. So this was from the AP. And if I were to just give you guys the spin up front, because I've seen this more than once, where they basically go, well, what you're saying is incorrect because we prefer our more flowery language. Like sometimes they actually get busted red-handed and you go, hey, you're advocating for quarantine camps. or like the same way, well, we don't want a lockdown. We just want everyone to stay in their houses for a couple more days. Like sometimes they go, well, no, we would never want to strip your freedom. We just want people to be safer. And so as a result, we're going to start turning off everyone's internet at 8 p.m. New York Governor Katie Hochul is trying to create quarantine camps in which people can be held against their will if they have COVID-19 or other diseases. AP's assessment, false. Officials have repeatedly said that the state has no intention to build quarantine camps. By the way, this is like classic in contracts where someone puts something in there and you go, hey, you can't have that. Well, we have no intention of enforcing it. Great, then pull it out. If you've got no intention of enforcing it, then why would we put that there so that you can go enforce it at a later point in time? If you've got no intention of enforcing it, then you can just pull it out and then we don't even need to have a conversation about it. It's classic. It's classic. Yeah. I mean, technically, we went to court and we passed a law so that we could do this to people, but we have no intention of ever doing it. Don't look at all the money and resources we went into getting this whole process done so that we could go enforce this thing because we have no intention of enforcing it. Really? Then why'd you show up to court and why'd you pass the laws if you got no intention of doing it? Let's continue. Officials have repeatedly said that the state has no intention to build quarantine camps. Critics are misrepresenting a temporary rule adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic that outlines powers by state officials to isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling that outlines powers by state health officials to isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling a highly transmissible disease. The rule said that people can be isolated or quarantined in interim housing rather than just their own homes, but doesn't mention camps. Okay, fine. It's not going to be camps, but I'm going to be forcefully held in an area outside of my own home. I mean, fine. All right. I guess you got me on the camp part, but I guess you're admitting to the fact that someone can be quarantined in interim housing. Yeah, I guess New York City doesn't have camps, but I guess you can shove me into one of these homeless hotels, or you can shove me into one of these spots that you've built for, I guess camps is the inaccurate word there. So in other words, you're saying that there is going to be, they did pass a law for forced quarantine. They just have no intention of building camps for it. Sounds to me like you're saying yes. So it's a yes to the forced quarantine part because people weren't too concerned with the camp part. It's like a very, I should have thought of that joke earlier. I can't think of the example, but it's like, yeah, I'll have to come back to that one. I'll have a joke for that one on the next one. It's just such a funny thing to go, no, we would never do the camp part. No one's cared about the camp part. It's the forced quarantine part. Sounds like I might even prefer if you built me a camp, then you shove me wherever you're placing these, homeless people. Isolate or quarantine people for the purpose of controlling a highly transmissible disease. Yeah, of course. I mean, so you're saying, yes, you are doing this, but it's because there's a reason for doing it.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Up until Netanyahu, not of course, like waving away any of the brutality of Israel's occupations, but they didn't go on these kind of like bombing campaigns the same way they do now. Yeah. It was much more special opsy and much more like targeting like the terrorists themselves. Innocent people died. More innocent Palestinians were always dying than innocent Israelis by very clear difference. But it wasn't the way it's been.
Well, I remember in 2005, our dear leader at antiwar.com, Eric Garris, told me, oh man, now that Sharon is pulling the last of the Jewish settlers out of Gaza, those poor people are doomed. You want to talk about human shields? They were actually shielding the local population, those settlers. And without them there, it's been bloody murder. I forget if Olmert, I think, I think Olmert started a pretty massive campaign in 2008, really in 2006 too, before Netanyahu came. And, Olmert that's Ehud Olmert. He had been Sharon's right-hand man, and Sharon and Netanyahu had been in Likud together. And then Sharon had split off from Netanyahu and formed Kadima. But he was basically, they're a hair apart on this stuff. Differences, severe differences in choices, I guess, but ideologically very close, right? So I think it might be fair to say that it was Olmert who really started it with these massive campaigns like this. And then Netanyahu has done, and Netanyahu came in, Siri, was it early 2009, like in the middle of the campaign, I think, of 2008, 2009, right before Obama was inaugurated. And they finally turned it off 2 days before he was inaugurated. But it went through that winter. And it was Israel that broke that ceasefire, of course. Well, not of course, but it was. And then they did it again in 2014, which is a horrible Operation Cast Lead, which, there's this wonderful book by Max Blumenthal called The 51-Day War about that. And they broke that ceasefire too. Oh, it was horrible. Do you know this story? So this is how cynical Benjamin Netanyahu is, dude. Okay. You thought you already knew? And I'm going to say November of 2014. Forgive me if I get my month wrong. I believe, or was it in the summer? No. It was in November of 2014. On the West Bank, I think it was 3 Hamas guys had broken out of their pen, crawled over the wall or something, got out. And then they picked up 3 Israeli Jewish hitchhikers. Hey, how are you guys doing? Hop in. Gotcha. And then they killed him. But the thing is this, Dave. One of the hitchhikers called 911, whatever the number is. And so they had it recorded. Help us, we've been kidnapped by these Hamas guys. Ah! And then pow, 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 pow. Okay, Netanyahu knows this. These 3 people are not missing. Their bodies are missing. They're dead. They know they're dead. And they know who killed them. They can't find the guys right now, but they know their names. They are 3 individual human men who killed these other 3 individual human men, right? Maybe it was 2 killed the 3. Anyway, Netanyahu leads the people of Israel to believe for more than 2 weeks that these 3 are still missing and presumed alive. And we have no idea who did it. It was one of them dirty Palestinian terrorists. You know how they are. And then sent the cops and the soldiers to run riot throughout the West Bank, killing people, demolishing homes, beating people up and raiding homes in the middle of the night and pure chaos, pretending to scour the area for these people. And this goes on for more than 2 weeks. And then I think it was some hikers or somebody stumbles upon the shallow grave and finds the bodies. And then Netanyahu goes, oh my God, everybody, they're dead.
There's like IDF soldiers who have defected and stuff like that who tell their stories.
Breaking the silence is what it's called.
Yeah, like and will tell you that, like, dude, it's just insane. You're running around there screaming curfew at these people, so they have to get inside their home. If they don't get inside there quick enough, they're pushing grandmas down on the ground and stuff. And I mean, you could just try to put yourself in that situation if you're like a 7-year-old kid and you're seeing some foreign occupying soldier pushing your grandma down on the ground, and then some terrorist group comes along and goes, hey, you want to join? You could totally see them being like, yes, I would like to. But so in 2005 in Gaza, and this is what you were referring to when you said so they did there were some Israeli settlements that were there, and they forced them out. They kind of
the army basically rooted them out of there.
Well, they paid a lot of them too. Like it was kind of like,
and then demolished the houses they left behind.
If they wouldn't take the money, they would. It's kind of what's the what's the term that I'm looking for when they take your house and give you money
foreclosure.
For it? No, eminent domain. It was kind of like an eminent domain. Thank you.
Look, what they did was they forcefully closed these illegal settlements and withdrew the people out of there.
So they got those people out of there, and eminent domain, but even that is by force. You don't have a choice in the matter. So they clear them out, and when they say they end the occupation, they pulled the IDF out of Gaza. So they make it sound like, yeah, well, look, okay, it was an occupation, but we ended the occupation. And then look what they did, in return to thank us for giving them exactly what they wanted. They elect Hamas. And okay, so there's like a lot of issues with that. Well, I did love Sheldon's, the way he put it was, he said it'd be like if all the prison guards left the prison, but they still kept all the doors locked and surrounded the perimeter. Right. And you were like, look, they're free. And you're like, no, that's not what freedom is. That's why, and then it's like, yeah, that's not at all. Like, what is that even? How is this even being spun? And that's why
I was using that same analogy where I was saying, if the West Bank is a minimum security prison where the Palestinian Authority are the trustees in the prison, right, subcontracting for the warden and his men, then in Gaza, Hamas is the strongest gang.
You can't give government the power to force good on the country without also giving it the power to force enormous evils on the country. I saw someone reply to a post that we put up today talking about how whatever power you give them to do something that you like, just imagine the absolute worst person you can even dream of having that same power and what they might do with it. Because that's who's probably going to have that power eventually. And I think Harry's point is incredibly important. It's incredibly timeless, especially as we live under the largest government in history. If you rely on the monster state to protect you, well, in essence, from itself, to keep you free, despite the fact that it's filled to the brim with absolute monsters, you're going to be really, really, really disappointed in the long run, even if you're not disappointed in the short run. Now, John Jay had a very similar take here that Harry did. This is all the way back in 1788. The first Chief Justice wrote that, remember that a power to do good always involves a power to do harm. Now, Harry Brown referred to this as the dictator syndrome. And this was, I think, chapter 5, If You Were King, or the dictator syndrome. Harry writes, government grows also because well-meaning people like you and me believe it should do certain things that seem beyond controversy, at least to the average person, at least. Find a cure for cancer, stop air pollution, keep violence off television, hold back an aggressor in the Middle East. And this is timeless stuff. Something that everyone seems to agree should be done. But should it be done by government? That's my question. And Harry says, I call this the dictator syndrome. You see suffering or danger, and in your imagination, you see a government program eliminating that danger. But in the real world, the program would operate as you expect only if you were an absolute dictator, having at your disposal all the government's power to compel everyone to do things your way. And you are never the one who gets in charge, because if you want to do good things, well, you don't really want to be in government. You don't want to be the person who wields all kinds of power that it shouldn't have. The largest government, the largest empire in history. We don't want to be a part of that. And the people who end up with the power are really not the good guys. I mean, even if they sound good in the short run. And now here's Oliver Ellsworth, third Chief Justice. A power of doing good always implies a power to do evil if the person or party be disposed. Now, ultimately, this all gets down to trust. Federalists like Jay and Ellsworth and many others, they basically were trying to craft a system where you could trust the system. Trust that it would draw only the good people to positions of power, and that the people wouldn't have to resort to much, we'll say, stronger things to keep government in check. Now, anti-federalists, and some of the federalists as well, anti-federalists primarily on the other hand, continually warned about having to trust people with power to do the right thing. Here, for example, old Abraham White in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, one of my favorite anti-federalist quotes, which is, "I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses." Or Patrick Henry down in the Virginia Ratifying Convention said, "If you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? Instead of trusting no one with power," and that includes the people who tell you trust no one with power. So John Adams, I think, is a great example of this. He says, "Trust no man with the power to endanger the public liberty." And John Adams, when he had power, well, you couldn't trust him because he endangered the public liberty with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. That doesn't mean everything else he did was terrible. It's certainly, even Jefferson would have been the same type of thing. But then he was bad with the embargoes from 1807 and beyond. And he even recognized that he went beyond the Constitution in his own view. He was willing to go beyond the Constitution for the Louisiana Purchase, something that he had said some years earlier. He said, to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to give them a boundless field of power. So one step beyond the limits of what they're authorized to do, even if you like the short-term results, this sets the precedent for other people to go beyond the limits. But most people today, instead of trusting no one with power, they totally trust their team with power. They trust their side of the equation, red or blue. And you can tell by their actions. Going to the federal government and asking the federal government to stop doing what the federal government wasn't even supposed to be doing in the first place is not a people living in the land of the free. These are not the actions of a free people. It's really the actions of a population on its knees begging for permission. John Hancock put it this way in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, "The powers reserved by the people render them secure." And again, it's not just because they're telling government, "Hey, you're not authorized to do this," and all that stuff that we didn't delegate to you, and, well, you just can't do it, and then they're just going to stop. That's not how it works. Here's how James Iredell put it in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. He was a leading Federalist, he was on the big government side of things, but he wasn't necessarily a Gouverneur Morris or Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't one of those guys who was like an ultra-high nationalist at the time. But he was in favor of more energetic government. Even Jefferson was, certainly over the Articles of Confederation. John Hancock, pretty much most of them really were. Even many of the anti-federalists who opposed ratification. It's not that they loved the Articles of Confederation. Many of them just wanted to see amendments to it. They didn't want to see more indefinite powers, things like the General Welfare Clause, things that could be twisted over time. So anyways, James Iredell put it this way: "The only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise." And if you unpack that, there's so much that you could unpack in this single statement. First of all, usurpation of power is an exercise of power not delegated to the government. As St. George Tucker put it, this is treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people. So the only thing that can be done to deal with a usurpation of power, not just a good idea, not something to try later, but the only resource is the inherent or natural right of the people to prevent its exercise. That's not the natural right of the people to ask or demand that government stop doing what government wasn't supposed to do in the first place. This is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So ultimately, if you want to stop government, here's how Iredell followed up. He said, "The people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it."
So every time the government comes in and says something about, well, we have to regulate this disinformation, they're telling lies and they're doing things, and we have to straighten them out. So we turn to our politicians who are nihilists, and they don't even believe in truth. So that's released, and that's where we are today, and trying to figure out, exactly what will happen and what the motivations are in the Middle East. That'd be a miracle if we heard the truth about that. Ukraine, the truth does come out eventually. I mean, it's sort of working its way out in Ukraine because it was such a disaster. It's some of the attention now is given the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But to me, Chris, a little bit of truth popped out. I don't know whether it was the Thanksgiving sentiment, but all of a sudden they exchanged prisoners. Well, if people could do that, and all of a sudden exchange these prisoners for their own, reasons. But why can't they do that and just say, well, why don't we quit bombing and killing each other for another year? And maybe they could get used to it. But anyway, I think that there is a systematic approach, an attack on our freedom of speech, the distortion of what speech is, and that the government, when they really want to make it fair and make sure everybody has freedom of speech, believe me, they're a long way off from the strict interpretation of our First Amendment.
Very good, Dr. Paul. Yes, you are correct, of course. Massive lies depend on mass broadcasting, and we have that today. And as you point out, the biggest misinformation people are the politicians and the media, and they work together. They put out the same narrative, this big narrative that they broadcast out, and unfortunately, many people still uncritically accept it. It's like they go to the TV to get their marching orders. And then the usual suspects come out, the big corporations and Hollywood and major sports teams, and then the celebrities are rolled out. So how this works should become obvious to more and more people as time goes on. But we have an advantage, people who at least seek the truth, because that only needs a single person. You don't need mass broadcasting.
But the Zero Hedge had an article yesterday. I want to just quote a little bit from it. It said, inside the UN plan to control speech online. Oh, that sounds like a good idea. A powerful United Nations agency has revealed a plan to regulate social media and online communications while cracking down on what it describes as false information. I wonder who will be the judge of false information and other conspiracy theories. In some ways, everybody's conspiring for something. If you get together in the most innocent, honest, positive way of getting 6 people together and start talking, how are we going to shift the momentum away from tyranny toward liberty? Oh, no. Put him in prison. He's a conspirator. We can't let that happen. So this is just terrible. I just think that warmongering and the violence in the world and the attacks on personal liberties has been led by government. That's why government's going to be around for a while longer, and it's been here for a long time. But at the same time, the government is the culprit, and yet they're the ones who are supposed to solve this problem and make sure that people don't obey this. But that's power. I think that. And I've said it for about every year that I've even thought about politics. You need the United Nations, and we can date so many bad things happening since 1945 and the opening up of the door, even the boundaries that they fought over in the Middle East, 20 years ago and lasting for 10 years, and the fighting that's going on in the Middle East. So much of that has been artificially created, by the UN edicts, and I think that is where the real problem is.
To me, they're just a bunch of people that sit around, they come up with totalitarian schemes, and then it gets public relations, a lot of public relations. Their schemes are always way out in the future, 2040, 2050. I mean, life changes so fast. Anyone can make stuff up about 2050. I could do that, but they do it and they have a PR department. I don't. So that's what they do. By the time 2050 comes around, nobody's going to remember what was said back in 2023. But in the end, thank goodness, the UN is toothless. They have no army. They have no taxing power. Each country must submit individually. So the people in those countries have to go along with it. And if a country refuses, they become the Florida. They become the one that proves that the UN scheme is nonsense. So again, you only need one to show the truth of the matter. And that's why all of these schemes of trying to get everybody in the world to go for this one idea is fruitless. It's a fool's errand. But they never stop. They're always coming up with something new, whether it be climate, whether it be gas stoves, you name it. They always have something. I guess it gives them something to do. But like Dr. Paul says, we have something to do too. And that's just to point out the nonsense of their ideas. A lot of people, as conservatives, are afraid of the UN as if, the Communist Party is going to take over the world. I'm more afraid of the conservative foreign policy than the toothless UN. The conservative foreign policy, they're already out in the Middle East again. That's scary. So forget about, you always keep an eye on the UN, but don't have the fear that they're, under everyone's bed.
And I think it's very true that it's well known that truth is treason in an empire of lies when we live in an empire of lies. And so it is very close to treasonous. I imagine, well, it really is. Think about the people who have suffered about January 6th. And now it's turning out that the videos are showing that there were a lot of lies told about that. And that essentially, insurrection. Those are lies. Truth is treason. And that's what it is. They're saying it is treason, and many people suffer from it. But we need clarity on this, and it can't be provided by the United Nations. It can be provided only by individuals sincerely looking and seeking the truth, realizing that it is liberty that will bring us the maximum amount of peace and prosperity.